Welcome everyone to the third tutorial of the day of the RoboCon 2024. My name is René Rohner. I'm the chairman of the Robot Framework Foundation, and I'm really happy to welcome Robin Mackay here to our third tutorial. He will talk about how you should organize your robot projects and give you a little bit tips and tricks and what you should avoid, what you should do, or give you options there. Um, so this talk will be available later on YouTube as well. And thank you for your participation. If you don't know what RoboCon is, it's an online conference and also on site in Helsinki, but this is part of the online conference. So stay tuned, go to robocon.io and see when you get the next tickets for greater, better tutorials and so on. And at that point, I want to introduce you to Robin Mackay. He's a test automation specialist at Encore in Netherlands and a longtime member of our community, very helpful also in our Slack community. So if you're not part of the Slack community, just go to slack.robotframework.org and type in your email address. You will get an invite to our great community with more than 20,000 participants there. And there you can ask all the questions you like to ask and communicate with our community, or you can use forum.robotframework.org to get feedback from other community members. So now that's it from my side. Robin, welcome, and stage is yours.
Thank you, René. So, topic for today, working with resources, libraries, and variables. Patterns and pitfalls. So let's get started. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. There's no absolute truth here. No best solution. I hope there are some good solutions, things that you can use, that you can apply in your context, your the repo you're working with, the projects you're working on, from the different talks, from the different chats in the community. Some people are working on as a single person on a single project for a small embedded project. Others are working with a team of 20 or 30 with hundreds of resources on a very large scale application. There's no single solution here. So take what you can use, think about how it applies to your situation. So we have an agenda. Introduction, we're doing that now. I want to kind of go over a global picture of a robot framework project. Something with variables, then about libraries, resources, then a pattern I've come to like over the years, and then a bit on visualization that I've been playing around with. So, the introduction, who am I? You can see me over there, somewhere in the crowd. Robin Mackay, I am about 18 years in test automation. Background, I started in more embedded environments where it was really Word documents for the test scripts, and there was no automation yet, but there was a lot of hardware. And then over the years, just more and more automation, more and more software, just what we see in the industry as a whole. And then the past 8 years or so, working mostly with Python, Robot Framework, and since a few years back in the consultancy, doing Robot Framework and Python consultancy things. So the why of this topic, and then that is just really the many questions we see over the years about how to organize projects. This was also a discussion that came up, I think, in an open space with the style guide group, where the question was posed. So how should I structure my project? What folders should I have? How should it look? And then the question is, well, that's not really a style guide thing. That's something else. And you can't really prescribe it. So also related to the language server, issues, questions, what happens, how does it work with variables, why are things slow, what can we do about that? Many questions like that also in the Slack. And then there's this part where Robot Framework is very flexible. We can do many things, and that is really nice and really powerful. But there are things that you kind of need to know. And also we see that, well, many people do not know, because it's, well, there's a lot in the manual. There's so much in the manual. Most of us don't have the time to read it all and remember it all. So some of these things kind of can bite you. And if you're not aware of them, that can sometimes you run into it, and that takes days to figure out, and then you learn something new. But, well, maybe learning something new every day is not the right thing to do. So Renee also briefly went over this. We're aiming about 4 blocks, hopefully around 30 minutes. Let's see. This is a new format we're doing here. This being online also makes the dynamics a bit different as working from a group. It's also not a workshop where you all are very busy doing things and I can just lean back and ask some questions and walk around and assist. At the same time, I did not prepare time box talks. We want to have some possibility of interaction. So let's see where it ends, how it runs. But the idea is about 15 to 20 minutes of content, and then I kind of want to give you some time to reflect on things. If you're sitting with a headset on, you probably want to have it off for a bit, stretch your legs. That's always a good idea. And then have some time to do Q&A, and not have one big Q&A at the end after 2 hours. So Renee also mentioned questions in the chat. Renee will be more monitoring the chat, so should be good. So we're talking about organization of a project. Now, in a discussion at RoboCon after a talk, we got on this topic a specific point on how to do some organization or how to handle certain thing around libraries, and we got into the kitchen analogy. So I thought, no, it's actually a good one, because so we could organize things by color in our kitchen. That's from some sites you'll see, well, you should have every color each day in your food because certain stuff is in certain colors, there's relationships. So, well, if we need to eat every color every day, well, putting things by color in your kitchen is an idea that might work. You could go by flavor group. For a balanced meal, you need 5 the 5 types of flavors. So you could organize all your ingredients like that. Maybe you keep it by type of meal. Here's the breakfast stuff, there's the lunch stuff, dinner stuff. Maybe the type of kitchen, because, well, certain type of ingredients like Asian has a number of ingredients yet you regularly use as a combination, and then for each type of kitchen worldwide it's a bit different, so you could organize like that. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, could organize like that, or whatever, wherever you put it. So we can organize a kitchen, but also your wardrobe or your garage in many different ways. And it's no different for your robot framework project. There are a lot of ways how to organize your project. So a short exercise, maybe it's a bit 10 minutes on the break, but what I would find interesting, if you think about how would you describe your project? How would you say it's organized? How would you ask, if your manager asks, if a new hire asks, how is this project, this repo, how is it organized? So I'd say spend a few minutes trying to see if you can mark this down for yourself, reflect on this, and then we'll continue. So the big picture in a robot framework project is very roughly as this picture draws. We have test suites. And what makes a test suite? Well, kind of the .robot extension in combination with the fact that there's a test cases section. That is the minimum to make something a test suite for robot framework. What can also be in there is keywords and variables. Those are your section in that particular robot file. Now, what a suite can also do is import libraries, import resource files, and import variable files. Libraries are something external. You probably pip installed them somewhere. Maybe you wrote them yourself. They give you keywords. Then there's variable files, which provides you with more variables. So basically external ways of getting keywords and variables into your test cases in your scope. Now, a resource file contains keywords and variables, cannot contain test cases. I prefer to use the .resource extension. I think it still works with .robot, but part of organization is probably giving something clear names. So I would always go with .resource extension for your resource files. And then resource files in turn can also, again, import libraries, import variable files, and import other resources that can do, well, the same thing. So those are our main ingredients, so to speak, for our robot framework projects. So let's look at variables for a bit. Now, there's quite many ways to set variables in a robot framework project. Already mentioned the variables section that can be in a suite or a resource file. You can import it from a variables file, which can be Python, YAML, or JSON. What we can also do is, at a higher level, set them as environment variables, which can be on an OS level or process level or in your container where you're running things. And then you can access them directly using the special syntax as shown, the percentage instead of the dollar thing. Then we can pass variables into a robot run by the command line, setting them as variables, or have a variable file, the YAML, the JSON, that you pass through the command line. And we can set them during execution. We can use the new var syntax since Robots Framework 7, or the set variable keywords, different flavors we have for them. Now, with that many ways of setting a variable and actually also overriding variables, then the question becomes, okay, who wins? What value for a variable will be used if a variable is available from many or multiple routes, basically. So we have the command line, that is the highest. So anything that goes into command line will override anything you have on your resource or suites. Then created in the variable section of a test case file, override those that are imported from a resource or variable file. So local goes over what you import. And if you have several resources or variable files with the same variable, then the first one being imported wins. And then there was also an order between resources in their variable sections and variable files. And then if you set them at runtime, those also trump whatever was there. And then there's some built-in variables that have the highest priority and you cannot override them, even if you would define them in a section. These were just some snippets from this section from the manual. The manual is about 3 or 4 times more text on variables and priorities. Since this can kind of bite you, it's probably good to read that section at some point. And maybe if you have read it in the past, read it again. So this is a priority, but then we also have scopes. We have the global scope. These variables are available for every suite, every test, in any suite, in an entire run. So if you do a robot dot, basically run everything in this project from root, we'll get this thing of a hierarchy of suites. And then if you pass a command line variable to that, all of them will have access to that particular variable. And remember, from the priorities, this goes over pretty much anything. So if you pass something to the command line, for every suite, everything, it overrides. Then we have the suite scope, which is in local variable sections and any resources or variable files imported. Which also means that variable sections in a resource are also in the same suite scope. Then there's the test scope, and that is actually initially empty. There's no variables in that scope, but you can set them there by using the var syntax or the set test variable. And then there's the local scope. If you call a keyword that returns something and you assign that to a variable that's a local scope variable, it's only available in the current in the current test or in the current keyword scope. Also, arguments received by a keyword are only available within the scope of that keyword. And if you use the var syntax anywhere, the default scope is also the local scope.
Maybe one addition on that point. There's a pretty important difference between these first three scopes and the last one. So the first three scopes, like global suite, test, and so on, are bleeding downwards the kind of the call tree, the call sequence. So if you call a keyword that calls a keyword that calls a keyword of something, a test variable will be available in that lowest level keyword when you call it. A local scope, once you call a keyword from a keyword, that called keyword has no access to local scope variables of the parent. So that's the major difference. It's really like only in this code block.
Yeah.
And maybe one thing about global scope, you said here like command line features. If you have watched the tutorial from Daniel, the one that we have already available on YouTube, I think here or here, you can click that later. You can learn about the RoboTurtle, where you can also set global variables based on profiles that you can execute Robot Framework with. So small teaser, you should check out these tutorials as well. Go ahead, Robin.
Definitely, because I think what Daniel is doing is definitely very helpful in controlling this and structuring this. And this talk is more about structure of project and how to handle things, and the tools can help you. So by all means, use them and watch those talks, definitely. So we also have the thing about matching, and this goes for variables and keywords. Now, because we want to have a framework where we can sort of use natural language as much as possible, and not have a strict programming language, means there are some rules about what is considered the same. If you do pure Python and you have a function get and another function get with a capital, then that's not the same for Python because the characters encoded are not the same. Since keywords in Robot Framework libraries are in Python, and Python does not allow things like spaces in function definitions, the convention there is lower, using an underscore. But we don't write natural language sentences with underscores. So get or create new user is what we want to be able to write in our test cases without underscores, without stitching it together to a single word. But in Python, we have to. The implementation has to. So because of that, well, of course, robot framework needs to change that behavior and map them together. So what robot framework does, we ignore case, we ignore spaces, and we ignore underscores to see, is this the same? Is this the same keyword? Is this the same variable? So this is quite important to realize. For robot framework, all these 4 ways of writing a variable are just the same thing. So if you in your project have these written differently in different places, well, which assigned value you'll be using in a certain test case or keyword, it kind of depends, because the whole thing about order and scope does play a role if the name is considered the same, even if it's not completely the same. You might say, well, in local, when I use something locally or in a test case, I use lowercase and my global variables are uppercase. Well, for robot framework, it's the same. And then this one is, my var is not the same because, well, you see the dash there and not the underscore. And this is actually a different variable to robot framework. And if you read this quickly and have this in code in many places, I know for a fact that in some projects I've worked on, this actually led to issues, because then you kind of overlook, you're looking for a name that looks like my var with an underscore, and it's actually a dash, so it's a different thing, and you don't realize that, and you get weird results. So it's a really good idea to consider style guide. Style guide has some ideas about how to name your variables, how to write them, but still always keeping in the back of your mind that even if you use uppercase for local or for higher scopes and lowercase for local scope, you still have to consider that they might be considered the same.
Robin, one intermediate question, because now I'm also scratching my head. If you do a lowercase my var with A and then you define an uppercase my var with B, are they then considered different, or is the uppercase my var assignment really overriding the lowercase one? Because I was thinking, like, as long as the other one, the specific one, does not exist, it is considered same. But once you have an upper and a lower, I think they are two different. But I'm not sure. Do you know more?
This is actually a very interesting one. I did some playground with these variations to see if what I'm saying is actually running like that, and
True.
logging,
Yeah.
and also going from a resource, import one, set it to a value, see what happens. But the specific case where I think actually the last one
They override.
wins. I think it's an override, actually.
Okay. Good addition here. The code playground. So if you want to play around and try out what happens when in Robot Framework, you actually don't need Robot Framework on your system. So the easiest way would just be to go to robotframework.org/code, and there you can try out just robot stuff and click the play button, and it will like execute a literal robot framework in your browser. So it will not be executed on a cloud environment. It will be in a web worker in your browser, and you can try out if what is overwriting which, and if you have a variable from a resource file, that is be overwritten by something local, and how the scopes work. For example. Go ahead, Robin.
Yeah. So going through these, we have some pitfalls that, well, so we could be, if you're not very careful with this, you could be matching variables in a higher scope than that you might have intended. You think I set this as a test variable, turns out some resource you imported has the same name, a colliding name, with some other value. Well, you can set your test variable to whatever you like. You'll probably get the default from your higher scope. So that is something to consider. If at all possible, use the lower scope would be something that I would suggest. If you don't need to go to a test or higher level, if you're fine with just a local scope, by all means do that. That does mean that you might have to pass your local variable to another keyword call to keep them local, but at least you'll be sure that you're not leaking it into a higher scope, even to the point where you could accidentally be leaking it into a suite scope, and then a next test is running and you kind of expect a variable to be at some default, but it was actually overridden by a previous test. So now you're not working with a default and going from there. No, you're just using something that was set by another test or even another suite.
Don't use test scope at all.
Yeah,
test scope, I
scope
think test scope is actually the horriblest invention ever, because yeah, I mean, the best thing is like assigning a test scope somewhere in a low hidden keyword, and that never appears somewhere upwards, but is used there or so. So
yeah, I was actually my colleague Guido here. We were just discussing this, and the test scope is in fact one that I would avoid if possible. You should really have a really good use case to use that scope. Now, I do have to say that I do have projects where we use this.
What? But
yes.
why?
Well, the thing is, and I did not have this on a slide, but if you want to use a local scope, then you have to pass a variable into another keyword. Now, if you have a scenario that is on a higher level, more of a business level type of scenario, there you don't want to be in the test case itself, be setting variables and doing all those technical keywords that determine some UUID or something unique that you need at some point to actually do your technical stuff. But for those test runs, that particular unique identifier is used to construct other unique identifiers that are used in 5, 6, 7, 8 different places to do replacements in XML files, setting headers for calls, putting stuff in a database, which from a business down is 4 or 5 layers deep. So at this top level, I need to figure out this thing, and I need them 5 levels deep. Now it becomes really messy if all those keywords need to be passed all these variables, not do anything with them, except for that one keyword that needs, well, only one of them. And then you trickle down like that. That is really, really nasty. I can tell you that from experience.
And I totally agree with you that exactly for that, the test scope is good to have it hidden on the low level, but you should know what you do there. And maybe when you access a test scope variable in a low level keyword, you should maybe comment like, hey, this is a test scope, or you define a naming convention for test scope variables that you directly, if you see that bastard running around, you directly know
Yeah.
what it is. So
yeah, and that is also an interesting one from discussions with the style guide group, and from Tidy and RoboCop. And they say like higher scopes and local scopes should be all caps, which is sort of well, Python has this convention for constants. Python does not really have constants, but if you do a capital name for a variable, you kind of tell the user, no, this is a constant, you should not modify this thing. This is not generally what we want to do with our variables. Some of them, yes, like the global ones that come in, you command line inject things like IP addresses or whatever things you just need to know within your test but not modify, then you could consider that a global a constant. But if we really want to assign it, and then it's not. So, and then there's two more scopes left compared to Python. So then what do we use? Well, camel case, kebab case, it's like meh. We have not enough ways to distinguish them. That is a bit of a thing. So avoiding test scope as much as possible, yes. But sometimes you'll just have to accept that there are use cases.
yeah.
So no absolutes, no best, no, but sometimes it's a good idea.
No,
now what Guido just told me, what he said, if you use test scope variables, I only assign them in the suite setup. And I actually like that one.
Okay.
Because you probably need them deep down. You probably have to figure them out pretty much at the start. And then that's a good place, and you always know where to find them.
Yeah, I think I intentionally also like pitched that. The point is with the test scope, you have to be thoughtful about that. And you have to think about people reading your code afterwards. And if you once try to understand or wrap your head around the robot framework acceptance tests, for example, where there are global scope variables set totally dynamically, whatever, where, and you have absolutely no clue where this variable is coming from, considering these implications, if you do dynamic variable assignment anywhere by var, by set test variable, or so, think of the people who are reading that. So, for example, always define a suite variable where the text in that suite variable is just like will be used on test scope, something like this. So maybe in edgy brackets or something like this. So that's a disclaimer that this variable is invalid, but it will be used in test scope. So you know that. And then it's dynamically set on a test scope, something like this.
Yeah.
Okay, but I didn't want to interrupt you so long, so go ahead.
No, that's perfectly fine. I mean, these are all aspects and way of dealing with this that I think are valid. And going back again, many ways to organize, but you should organize it and consider how you organize it and be consistent in that. The same with I've used in previous projects like a global resource import with all basically all test and suite variable and global variables with a default that cannot run properly, like just set it to none if possible. With comment blocks, okay, these are global variables that must be passed through the command line. These are suite variables that will be manipulated or need to be set by. So that if you're using a language server and you highlight like that particular variable, you see where it is defined, and you can go there and then you see, oh wait, this is one that should be set by. So let's continue a bit because this also touches on what's upcoming. Using different ways to set variables in a scope is also a pitfall that I see. I would use as little different ways to set variables to a certain scope as possible. Like we can use the command line to inject global variables, but we can also inject them to the environment of the running robot process and use the percentage notation to access them. It will work the same. But if you do both, that's not helping, I think, because then you have to manage how things are sent to the command line, and you have to manage how variables are made available in your environment. So if you need to inject global variables, I would say either all of them go through the command line, or all of them are accessed from the environment, but not both. And much the same goes for using variable files, using variable sections. There's many ways. Use as few as possible. Also, a pitfall that I see is importing variables that are not needed. We had this whole scope thing, we had the matching things. If you don't import it, you can't conflict with it. Simple as that. So minimize your imports, I would suggest. Some patterns that I found helpful that can solve some of these problems. Not all of them, but some. And I would, the principle of proximity, and that roughly says related things should be closer to each other than to unrelated things. And that is a bit vague, but it's also quite helpful. So what we could do, if we could have a single resource with all keywords that manipulate a certain test suite or global variable. This is one way where you can ensure that a certain suite variable or test global variable is manipulated. You can find all the keywords that do that, and you find them in one place. Principle of proximity. They are related. They should be as close together as possible. This prevents the situation where a certain suite variable is defined in some resource and then spread around your project somewhere in 4 or 5 different other resources. You'll find keywords that actually do something with that variable. Then if something weird happens in your runtime, it will be quite hard to figure out what happened where, what could be happening where. So this is a way to organize this. Also, setting test and suite variables in the suite test itself and not importing them. Just for the longest time, what I did is I have a suite, I have a test section, and I want it to be as clean as possible. Don't put a keyword section in there, don't put a variable section in there. You know, a pattern that we see, like put the variables together, put the keywords together. Here's my test cases. I use those keywords. Nothing else is in there. Over the years, I came to think different on that. So principle of proximity. If there's this test variable, well, if it's related to this suite, maybe I should put it here. Maybe that's the better idea. It is. Going a bit more extreme is you could make a custom Python library where you have just a few keywords to basically create a variable in there and retrieve it from there. If you may know, libraries can have a scope, and you can give the library a scope of test, suite, or global. And what you could do is make a test scope library, and then you are sure that if you have keywords or local scope, create a variable, put that in your library by a keyword. If you need it elsewhere, retrieve it from the library using a keyword from that library, and you're sure that that variable never leaves the local scope. There are no variables. There's no global variables there.
Maybe for clarification, and I try to repeat what you said in my own words.
Sure.
You're not meaning like really creating robot framework variables from a library, but you mean like, for example, let's say we have a transaction, and you fetch a transaction from a one-time password email, or a transaction number, so like a secret number, one-time password. And you could have a test case scoped library that has something like fetch a transaction number from email, which will read the email and store within the library itself as a Python self.ton number or so, this transaction number. And every time later in the same test, when you need this transaction number, you can just call the getTon keyword, which then just returns self.ton from that Python class to the test. So, which is the better way, I do agree, to maintain the situation of on multiple places, I want to access something that is test specific. And you have never this kind of weird from nowhere appearing library, a keyword that has never been returned or assigned to something. Yeah, okay. Because I just want to say that because that I have seen lately that people are doing Python libraries, and in the init of the Python library, they call built-in bracket open bracket close dot set test library, something like this. With this super no, don't ever do that. Yeah. So there I would say no excuses. Never set a test library from your Python code, because you will never find that bloody thing.
No, that is a good way to obscure things and get them lost. Yes, that is something I would agree with. Now, you could like this. I mean, there's a number of options here, right? And I'm not saying one is better than the other.
But a stateful library is a pretty good situation for removing that complexity there.
Yeah.
And in Robot Framework, you're only dealing with local variables then.
Yeah. Unless you have this, well, I mean, I can see globals, because there's a typically command line. That's just, need some server reference, or depending on your environment. So we'll have those. That is fine. But typically you don't have to have them at a test scope variable level or even suite. Now, like what we were also discussing, the situation where you have a test variable because you have to generate something unique, and then deep down in technical keywords need them, then a library like this could also be a solution. That unique thing that you need, unique name or base name, could be generated by the init of a test scope library like this. And then you just say get transaction ID, get time, whatever variations on that piece of data you need, and not put it in a test variable, not pass that down, but just have a small library with dedicated keywords. Now, this is actually just basically the Python solution to the top option, a single resources with the keywords that manipulate a variable. And you could actually make it so that it's completely generic with a keyword store variable with a key value and retrieve variable by key. Quite easy to make, but you might want to be more specific. So I just remembered that I should probably have the link to this for pasting in the chat. I did not. I did prepare a very simple.
I can dig it out.
Script. Ah, cool, thanks. It's just a simple Python script. If you're not really into Python, just take a look at it, read it. It's learn some Python, that's fine. From the Git repo, you can just say download the file. If you put that in the root of a Robot Framework project repo, in your terminal, you can do Python robotvar.py, and it will just output something. It basically scans for finding keywords. It will report you the condensed name, lowercase, no underscores, no spaces, with a list of all versions that were found in your project. You might want to run it, see what's reported, and then consider, is this intentional? Is this what I expected to see? Is this something that I want to see? So I'd like to say a 5-minute break now. Is that an idea? It's we're about 1 hour in now. Just stretch the legs a bit, maybe grab a drink. And
how long does this chapter go?
I would say this is the chapter for now, and then we'll continue on with libraries. So this is the last one for variables.
Okay. So should we do a Q&A session first and then go to the breaks?
Oh, that's fine. We can also do that. Yeah, sure.
So then if you have a question now and want to discuss stuff with Robin, you can just raise your hand. If you're desperately leaving to another room or so, just do so.
Fine.
We will earliest start in 5 minutes, and we will put a timer on screen, I think, as well, or maybe not, but yeah, maybe. Let's see. Is there anything? Vaclav, do you want to like phrase your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Maybe Robin, you talked about it, but I didn't catch it. Why do you need to store some variables? I know why do you need to read some variables, yeah. But why do you need to store them to be used in another test or so? It seems as a test dependency for me. Thank you.
Well, within the same test, you could have the situation where in your test scenario, for example, you first create a new user, and that API call returns you, for example, the UUID of a newly used user. And then you might be calling keywords, and those keywords can be calling keywords. And one of those keywords that calls another keyword needs that information. Now you can either pass that down, or you might say, okay, I don't want to be passing that bit of information all the way down with all these keywords that kind of don't need to have this information, other than that they call a keyword that calls a keyword that needs the information. So then you could say, okay, do that library approach, maybe put it in there. And then the keyword down there that needs that information, you just call the keyword from the library and get the information that it needs. So is that an answer to your question?
What Václav, you kind of implied that the dependency of tests be between each other, right? So if the first test set a sweet variable, and then the second test will use that, and that is definitely a no-go, like also Robin mentioned. So sweet variables should be either defined by the variable section, or by the importing of a resource file, or in the sweet setup. You shall not define a sweet variable within a test dynamically. So that is, I would say, definitely a bad practice to define a sweet variable or a global variable within a test. So that whole dynamic stuff is really like, Did this answer your question? One moment, you can do thumb up, or do you want to say something again?
No, thank you.
Okay. Then we have Neil there.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
I can hear you.
Okay. I apologize. The variable scoping it's still confusing to me a bit. So I have the user guide pulled up. They're listing 4 different scope levels. So there's global, test suite scope, test case scope, and then local scope. So I had asked about the difference between the test suite scope and the test case scope. But then also when you're saying that, I think you said that there's like lower or higher scopes. I think you said use the lowest scope possible. Are you considering the local scope the lowest, or is that the highest?
The local scope is a bit special, I would say.
Yeah, but also the lowest. Yeah.
So local is the lowest.
Well, the thing with what Renee and me also were mentioning, like, don't use the test scope. Use the lowest as possible, yes, but because almost anything that we in a test script through import of variable files and by using a variable section is actually already a sweet scope, makes it a bit hard to pull that down to a test scope. I would have actually liked it if those sections were test scope based, because then you'd have them at the lowest scope possible, and you would need to be explicit about raising their scope. Because what the whole thing about test interdependency, what just was raised, kind of ties into this. You kind of want a test to be atomic. You should be able to run the tests in any order and run them individually and not affect each other. And sweet scope and global scope variables kind of go outside that. Because if you always set sweet scope variables and you change the order of tests and they all do something with those variables, that information will carry over to the next test.
Right, that makes sense.
So and I think this is so as a rule of thumb, I think you should typically not assign a variable in a smaller area that has a higher scope. So for example, in a test, you should not override or you should not set a sweet scope variable. You can override a sweet scope variable locally, but once the test is left, the old variable value will be again valid there. This is something, and I would generally consider like dynamically defining scopes of variables shall have a very good reason for doing that. So I think it's fine, for example, to define an init robot something like a global variable. But on the other hand, typically a sweet variable on that thing would work as well. So and same like defining somewhere in a keyword a test case variable in a resource file, and another keyword in another resource file is reading that test case variable can be super damn confusing. You have no clue what value will be there and the point of execution. You cannot track it down. And that's the problem with all these scopes other than the local one. So in generally, I would say avoid scopes. Define variables in the variable section, import variables from variable files, from resource files, and so on. But do not kind of define them dynamically and specifically not the higher scopes. That can be really tricky debugging later.
Yeah, and I mean that there's within the community between the dev groups also been talk about this, like how can we isolate variables more? At some point in this session, the page object model will be briefly discussed, and what you typically see there, we're then in doing web automation, and we need selectors, and you typically see a file with keywords that do clicking and stuff like that, and they use locators for that, and then you see a variable section with those locators. But because this is a resource, those are sweet scoped variables.
Yeah.
And personally, I don't even want those variables visible outside that particular file.
Yeah. And that's
just this resource file. We don't have that now. If at some point in the future we have that, that would be very helpful, because then we can say like, okay, I have this nice resource. I have
and the
variables
resource scope variable, right? So a resource scope variable would be something that is really important, because you have one resource file and then you have another resource file, and both resource files you have $var. And then you import them in and you use them in the local keywords there. And you think, yeah, of course, I have it in ** variables defined and I use it in a keyword. And then you import in one test, in one suite, you import resource 1 and then resource 2. So resource 1 will win because it was there first. And in another suite, you re-import it vice versa. So the other one will win. And in both resource files, it will win. So once imported, that suite variable, the ** variable section in the resource file will be ignored. So it's really a tricky situation, and therefore local like resource scopes would be good. But that's a rabbit hole I think we cannot cover in 2 hours. It's a really you should try it out. You should really try out what happens.
Yeah, maybe Robot Framework 8. It has been discussed. We're talking about it, and then it's really indeed like especially when you get to locator strategies. I've seen this be a problem, because then it's like, well, this page has a back button, and this page also has a back button, but the locator is different because it's a different class in another page. So we now have 2 variables back button, and then you kind of either have to start prefixing them with the page name, and then if you go into a debug session and have to look at your variables, then you see a long list of variables, and then those are completely not interesting, because those are actually CSS selectors that are only used in the keywords there. And you just want to find the variable with data that you're actually using. So there's quite a bit of things about the scope here that play a role and that are not so easy. So just awareness and understanding, you know, I think it's important that we all understand this, know this is happening, know this is why this is happening. Also debugging is really nice. I mean, just do that for once. Just put a breakpoint somewhere in the keyword for your run it, click open those local suites test scope variables and see what's in there. It can show you.
And the same issue we have with the library import situation. It's similar because you're also importing into a suite scope, and when you leave the suite, then something else happens, and so on. And there was a question: is this well documented, or it was just like, is this mentioned in the documentation? I think mentioned it is, well documented it's not. That's why we also do this tutorial here, right? Or Robin does it, yeah.
Yeah. From a number of slides at the start, all the very small letters that you could really not read in the time I showed it are just snippets from that user guide. So there's more to say about it. It is well documented in that sense. But there's also the difference between having it in documentation and actually reading and comprehending it. From a practical perspective, and I'm trying to show some practical implications from, well, what is described in the manual. Do we have any more in the chat, or?
No, I think we can proceed with the next chapter.
Okay.
Just one question. Variables imported from a resource file or like defined in a resource file and then imported in a suite will have the variable scope of that suite. But once
we'll have the variable scope suite, yes.
Yeah. And once it's there, all other same named variables imported by other resource files will be ignored because we have already one in the suite scope. So they are not overwritten.
Yeah, the first one imported wins. It's I think that's
same in libraries
one
as well.
Of the lines in this a few slides ago. It actually, if you know what you're looking for in the documentation, it's there.
Yeah, first imported wins, but last set wins.
Yeah. So there's also that. Yes, it's so and
lowest
that
scope
is why...
lowest scope wins when you read them.
Yeah. So this is also, well, that small script. I mean, big disclaimer on that script is also that it just does a quick scan of the pattern for how we can set and use variables in Robot Framework. It doesn't say anything in this form of the script about scope or usage. I mean, if people are interested in that, I mean, the script could be expanded, but what it does not do is look at variable files that could also, again, be conflicting, but writing a simple script like that's nearly impossible. I think Daniel discussed it in his talk also, because it's so dynamic. If you do a Python variable file, you could have any variable name be available in the suite scope that you need to run the code to.
But yeah,
sure what the name of the variable and the value is, and whether or not it's there. So.
As one side note regarding variable files and robot code will actually execute variable files. Therefore, be aware that your variable files is also working if there's no running context available. So when you make that thing. But let's go to the next chapter.
So
wait a second. There is was a question from Jenny. Where is it? I may have missed it. Should storing decrypted password and variables be avoided? Yes. Decrypted
Yeah, I would
passwords should
say
not
so.
be in variables. Yes.
Yeah.
You should generally somehow not hand them over through robot framework.
This is typically where I would say that accessing environment is a good idea. And you kind of don't want to pass them to keyword calls, because if you're logging at trace level and not taking measures to prevent them from ending up in the trace level logging, you will, because robot framework, if people are not aware, if you set the trace level, any arguments going into or being returned from a keyword will be logged. And there are some special keywords and things that to work with secrets, but if you don't deliberately use them, that logging will just happen. So definitely be very careful with keywords. Typically in pipeline environments, your secrets will come from the pipeline's secret thing. They can be injected in the environment of the running container mostly, and then just pull them from the environment and use them directly, not pass them through or do things with them. That would be my advice.
And there are some libraries that help you. For example, Robot Framework -crypto is one library that gives you the possibility to store store secrets in an encrypted manner in your files, and is decrypting them then on runtime. And for example, if you use browser library set secret, I think type secret and fill secret it's called. You can just use a variable that contains an encrypted secret by crypto library and will decrypt it internally. So there are solutions, but you should be aware of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the browser library actually warns you if you use the normal variable way of passing a variable, because that can also expose it. So it actually advises you to use the special variable notation. But definitely another topic to be aware of. So continuing to libraries now. Again, here some things that you should know. And every time a library is imported, it is initialized. If you're from a Python background, typically if you import something, if you import a class from a module, you'll just have a reference to that class that then in your code you can instantiate. The robot framework libraries work a bit different. They are actually initialized when you import them. That needs to be done to check what keywords they make available, and also from the language server perspective, the language server needs to do the same. They need to load the library to get access to the keywords, so you have things like autocomplete and all that. So the time it takes to initialize a library depends on the library. Guilty as charged. I still need to do a thing that was discussed on the community day on this topic for my open source libraries, the OpenAPI libcore. That takes an argument. That argument is an OpenAPI specification that needs to be processed. And at a customer, I found out that can actually take quite a bit of time. that is a very big API, and processing that file takes about 20 seconds. Now, if that happens in the library init, anytime that library is imported, that 20 seconds will trigger. I did alleviate that somewhat, but there's ways to make that even more lazy so that the language server does not have to take that penalty the first time it loads it. But be aware that just writing library, and importing it's not free.
Yeah,
Most of the time,
it executes the init, the constructor of that class, and that is the important thing. So
yeah,
the keyword here would be properties. Use properties and not some self variable that takes time to be set.
Yeah, that is for our library devs good advice. But even if you, be aware that this is happening. So more libraries is just more overhead. Also, we can make Python variable files, and that kind of works the same as loading libraries because the code in that variable file is executed. So if you, for example, have a variable server name that you retrieve by doing some API call to another system to give you that server name, and then you return that as the value for your server name, well, you just did an API call in that variable file, and that takes time. So just the fact that you reference this variable file means that there will be a penalty at runtime, but there you really need to do it. But the penalty will also be there for your language server. And especially if, for example, for local development, you cannot make that API call, that will be an issue for a language server. So something to be aware of. So naturally, one of the pitfalls is just importing libraries that you don't need to use in your suite. It just takes time, and it might be little or it might be a lot, depending on the libraries you're using, or actually not using, but importing. So be aware of that.
If the library has not a global scope, or so, because then it will be anyway already being imported, so it does not matter to have it in a resource file or so. So if you know the scope of the library, that is a thing that you have to that you can use for decisions.
Yeah, but at the same time, realize that the default scope for a library is suite, if I'm not very much mistaken.
I don't know. Maybe
I believe it is a suite scope by default. So if the library creator did not explicitly change it or set it to something else, I think it's the suite scope. So also your language server, if you have a library imported, then it has keywords, and the language server will suggest those in autocomplete. And that can be quite annoying if you just are not using them. It's just more options to pick the wrong thing, in my opinion. A special case that we spent, I think, 2 or 3 hours talking about during the community day in the morning is libraries that take arguments. If you have in your projects multiple places where you have an import statement for a library that takes arguments, and you do that with different arguments, good luck figuring out what you're going to be running with.
Oh, running is pretty simple, the first one, but importing all. So
yeah, but the first one kind of depends on
the scope.
some orders. I think you could be very creative also when running, and especially if you do command line run and you select specific suite or exclude them, then you might actually end up using another import than the one that you're using when you would run all of them. And then it becomes very, very confusing. So that's probably not a good situation to have.
Yeah. So I think in general, the recommendation is don't try to import with different arguments and expect that you get what you expect. So that is nothing that you should do. And if you have a library with different arguments, it will definitely be initialized. But possibly the keywords that you got there are not the keywords from this secondary initialized library, but the ones from the first one.
Yeah.
So therefore, avoid it in general. Import it on one part in your code and one literal line in your code and write your arguments there in that line and import that resource files multiple times, and then you have the same import, the same configuration. Except if you have local variable test scope things. Yeah.
Note that variable files, if you use the Python version that implements the get variables in that variable file can take arguments. So they kind of act like libraries also in that sense. It's being executed and it can take arguments. And anything that in your project where you have the same thing being imported with different arguments is a rather big risk, because you just don't know what you're going to be getting. Of course, there are ways to alleviate this. Again, principle of proximity. Well, if a suite needs a library with specific arguments, then just import it in that particular suite. But this is very tricky material, so I would suggest, if at all possible, use only one set of arguments for a given library. I wouldn't, well, no absolutes again. But you might consider having a separate repo.
Yeah.
If this is the case, so you isolate things.
And I think that the tricky thing is, for example, or the unexpected thing is, if you would have a global library like browser library, and you think, oh, in one suite, so in my one robot file, I imported with one arguments, and then in another robot file, I imported maybe with other arguments. It behaves differently than if I import it in the same suite with one and another argument. So that even that it has a local scope just means that one library instance with the one set of arguments is kept until Robot Framework stops. But still an import in one robot file is independent from an import to another robot file. So if you import it twice in one robot file, it's something different. If you import it in a higher init suite or so, it's again something totally different. So
and if the scope of the library is different, suite, then your results are different again.
Yeah.
So this is just something to be very, very careful with, and not just casually doing your project. So let's move to resources. Now, I would say resource files are basically the glue of your project. They provide keywords for your suites and other resource files. They can define additional variables. They import libraries again. They import variable files. And they import other variable files. They're just tying everything together if you look at it from a perspective of a test suite. So in that sense, resource files is where your reuse happens. If we would not be using resource files, we'd have a number of test suites, and each suite would have a variable sections and a keyword section, and import some libraries, resource files, and we'd have a lot of keywords being duplicated between suites because we would have no place where to put them for reuse. So this is I think the main thing for resource files. This is where you group things and reuse them. So this is naturally the point where things can go really wrong. One of my favorites there is the one resources to rule them all. I've written those. It's really nice in your test suites. Import general.resource, and you do that in every suite. And it's super convenient because your suites are just one import. You're done. You write your test case, nothing else. It's also, you have all the keywords available, also very convenient, but maximum chances to have keyword collisions if you have the same named keyword in multiple resources or available from libraries. Robot Framework won't like that because, well, which one should it be using?
But you will directly see that. That's also a good thing. If you in 90% of your cases only import A or B, and in that 1% you import A and B, and then you get the conflict. So if you always import A and B, it's a little bit contradicting of do not import what you don't use, but it helps you finding these bugs early.
Yeah. These are definitely, the pitfalls. It can go really wrong, especially also the variable collisions, because those are not so loud when they happen. Like the keyword is like the runtime will just tell you, I don't know which one to use. I stop here. The variables, well, we just discussed the variables. We're using something. Maybe not what you wanted to use, but there is something. Also, back to an IDE, your language server, you get everything offered as autocomplete suggestion. I don't find that helpful in many cases because then more suggestions is more clutter on what you're doing. Also, maximum strain on the language server. Daniel probably explained it in his tutorial. I could not fully follow it, but I know he's been explaining this on Slack a few times the past few weeks. If you change anything in your project, if you import everything always, well, it needs to go through the entire project to see what the change you made, what the effect is. If you just renamed a keyword, then that has implications. If you change the variable name, it has to figure that all out. And if this goes big, if you have big projects, then this will take a lot of time. So yes, there's convenience, but there's definitely downsides. Be aware of that. At the same time, if you have a very small repo with not much in them, but a number of suites that pretty much work on the same project, need all the same resources. Well, if everything needs everything, then, well, then that's your situation. Then this is a good solution. But it's not always a good solution.
Maybe one addition here, because this, like you mentioned now, don't use libraries on spots where you don't need it because they will cause resources.
Yeah.
I think this is, so I would say this is half true. The problem is, I would say it is true for libraries that are resource consuming by importing itself,
Yes.
which shall not be the case anywhere. So
Should not.
importing a library shall be damn easy and damn lightweight. If you have libraries, they take time when importing, fix the code or complain about the code that it shall be fixed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I'll
I
fix
think
it.
in general, I would say libraries are better if they have global scope, as long as they don't need suite specific state or test specific state. So I would say every library developer that writes a library shall set the scope to global, as long as there is no specific need for having a new object instance every time a suite starts or every time a test case starts. Because also that, like, throwing away a library, reinitializing that library takes time. And also this is not needed. Like garbage collection takes time and so on. So global scope shall be the default. And only if you need a test scope, then it should be that one. But still then, the bare initialization of a library shall not consume any resources.
Yes, I'll do that. let me fix that somewhere next week or something when I have time again. So some other kinds of pitfalls that I would that I see, and a resource file with no clear purpose is one. There's a risk of importing unlimited libraries, other resources, and variables into the test suite scope again. Because if you don't have a clear purpose, then it kind of attracts, oh, let's just also put this in there. And then you get a mix of things. And then if you need one of the things from that library, you get everything. You also have a high risk of duplication in your project. If it's not clear where to look for things like variables, like keywords, it's quite easy to just create your own new keyword, create a new variable for your problem. While it might already exist in your project in some resource, but when looking, you really need to know where, and having a clear scope for your clear purpose for your resources really helps there. It also makes refactoring your project a lot harder if you have no clear idea of what is found where. And it probably goes against that principle of proximity. Yeah. put things together that are related. Well, if you have no purpose, you have no clue what's in there, then it's probably not related. Before we go to the next section, I would if you have a small break, look at some think of some resource files in your project. Try to write down, just scribble it down for yourself. What is the purpose of this resource file? Why does it exist? Why do I have it in my project? And if you look at what's in that resource, does that follow the principle of proximity? So, moving on to the final part. And well, let me get my presentation running again. Please go. Yeah, there we go. So one pattern I want to be talking a bit about is the Rocky River. Mr. David Seddon, he, I think it was already 2018 or even earlier that he had wrote a blog post that I stumbled upon, and I liked it. It's actually about Python projects and structure, but I like the analogy and how you can think about your project, and a number of concepts in there that I think can be applied really well to Robot Framework projects. So I'd like to go through that and some explanation on this. So the Rocky River is about a flow of data and rocks. And the rocks are basically functional entities in the original architecture. But if we apply this to Robot Framework, we can say, okay, so a rock is a resource or a resource group with a clear goal. And, well, we have a documentation tag, and that is really a good place to write this down. That's actually an exercise that you could just do on your repos, like write the documentation for your resource. What does this thing do? Why is it here? What is this functionality? Now, such a group, a rock, that may import libraries and variable files and might create variables that it needs. Probably implements some keywords. And then within that little rock, so to speak, you can use relative imports. What that means is that if you take the top entry point of such a rock, it's probably a folder, you can just move it in your project, and as long as you refer to that entry point, then you're fine. You don't have to update any more relative imports or anything, because they are an entity. They belong together. So in this little rock, we have all the variables, libraries, keywords that it needs to provide the functionality that it clearly defines, that it describes. So it's a very clear entity in your project. You know why it's there, and it has everything that it needs. And you might already see where the principle of proximity comes in here, because it's related, so it's together. You can find it there, and it's well described. So how does this relate to the project? The page object model is a model that we get some questions about on Slack also. For those that are not from the web automation space, it's a pattern that is used quite a lot in web automation, where well, the object is kind of, because of the JavaScript origins, it's a class that has everything related to a single page of a web application. Because this is a known pattern, people are often asking, so how do I implement that in Robot Framework? Well, for me, if I'm looking from this Rocky River type of architecture, it's just a rock about a web page. And it's generally a technical type of object, of page, of resource. It's really about the how. What selectors do I need to do a click on a button? What buttons are there on the page? What controls are there, and how do you use them? That type of keywords. Another pattern that we sometimes get questions about is the screenplay pattern. This one is a bit less known. It's a design pattern for user-centric scenarios. So it's more about the what. It's also from the web testing domain, but instead of talking about what is this page and what can I do on this page, it's about an actor that follows a flow through an application. So that might be touching multiple pages, but it's really about the business flow here. So we see typically business-facing keywords here, and tests use business-facing keywords from what I would then call more of a business rock. Because also this could be a resource with those user-centric keywords, but it's still a very clean, close purpose, what we're seeing here. So here's our business rock. I needed an AI generated image, so here you go. So if I were to draw it for a Robot Framework project, would be something like this. We have the test suite at the bottom. In many cases, they are business facing. They describe user interactions and things like that. Again, not for every project. We have a lot of people from a more technical automation space, embedded space, then it might be a bit different. But it's one way to look at it. So the rocks towards the top are generally the more technical ones, and then the ones more towards the test suites are more business facing. So those are little ties on the rocks. So that's your business rocks. Now, if you structure like this and give those rocks, those resource groups, a very strong focus, very clear purpose, it also makes it easy to extract them and reuse them between projects. So this is also a pattern that can help you supporting splitting a repo if that is necessary. So, but then how do we get there? How do we draw this? What is, like, it is nice that I can draw some rocks and lines, but how does that actually, how do things in real project relate? This is why I'm doing this talk. Thinking about this is because I had this issue at hand. Getting insight in existing projects. How is this tied together? What is happening? Why is it? What is happening where can I find things? So I had this idea of visualizing a project using a graph. And so the challenge for myself that I set for myself, like, well, can I build an ontology for a robot framework project? You'll probably be, what is an ontology? Well, we have a Wikipedia definition. Metaphysics, the philosophical study of being. It is quite a bit of text. It's an interesting page to read on Wikipedia. But from Ontotext, a company that's in this field, they say it's a formal description of knowledge as a set of concepts within a domain and the relationships. So what we see is that we're describing some knowledge about a domain. So our domain is robot framework, and we describe relationships between things within our project. Okay. And then we are talking about knowledge graphs. So we have a data model, and we have facts, and we can create a graph. A lot of text again, but in the end, we get to a resource description framework. It's a W3C standard. It's actually the biggest model in modeling triple stores, and then they call it turtle files. It's all things like, okay. But if we just make an example, it looks something like this. So we say a test suite is a class, basically, and the test case is a class, and resource file is a class. Okay. So then we can say, well, my test suite is a test suite, and the test suite has a file path, and the test suite imports some resource, and it contains test cases, and it contains keywords. These are all facts about things in our domain. Our domain is Robot Framework Project. And we have classes and relationships between these classes. And, well, if you can create a turtle file like this, you have a databases, graph databases, that can show you something like this, a visual graph. So it's not that readable, but if you actually start this, it runs in your browser. If you load a turtle file, you can drag and drop the little dots, and you have an entry point. And if there's more relationships, like for example under web, in this case, if I were to double click that, it would expand more of those dots. Colors represent different sorts of resources. And the arrows are certain relationships. This is also a database. There's a query language, so that you can filter out things. So this is a bit of a thing that I was working on, because then if you could see how is Suite, what it imports, and that imports something, you can follow all these lines, and you can see, for example, which resource files are using a certain variable. I called it RoboTurtle, just as a working name. So I was playing around. So can I generate a turtle file from a Robot Framework project? You saw something that I manually typed out. That's just a lot of work, especially in bigger projects. So you would want to generate that. I tried a bit, played a bit with that. And the conclusion is that is not so easy. The whole way Robot Framework parses our suites and import things, load things, relates, you kind of need to write a parser, rewrite the parser to get this information. So it's quite a bit of effort. So there were some options to explore. I should ask Daniel. I actually sort of talked about this, kind of mentioned this. Because like RoboCode, being a language server, needs the same information, or at least much of it. So if in some way RoboCode could provide this information, then that could be processed in a turtle file, and then you could visualize that. Other idea I had was to implement a listener that, with the new new listener implementation in Robot Framework 7, should have most, if not all, information that you would want in such a turtle file. Of course, you'd be restricted to only having the information visualized of what is actually running and being used. But even that can give you some good insights in how is my project structured. So this is all experimental work in progress. Not sure if this will actually fly, but who knows, if people find it interesting. It's always good to hear. So to wrap things up, bit of a summary. There's many ways to organize a kitchen. To organize anything. Think about this really well in your project. Think about it again if you start a new project. Maybe start changing it if it doesn't fit anymore. But realize there's no one size fits all. There's no single best way to do it. Just it's all context, so be aware of that. Realize that when structuring your project, you are making trade-offs. The whole thing about a single import with everything, there's downsides to that. But if you split up everything in really, really small chunks, there's also disadvantages to that. Especially also when you need to import libraries, the more you split, the more places you might find where you need to. So consider that. Consider the principle of proximity. I find that a pattern that is just generally helpful in making choices about where to put things, how to put things, and why you put things where you do. Less is more. If you're not using it, don't import it. Don't have an archive, don't have an old, just throw it out, keep it out of your repo, please. If you really don't want to throw things completely away because you might need to reference it in the future, take it, put it in a different repo, but keep your repo as small and clean as possible. Visualization can help you keeping things organized. Generation of it might be difficult, but just take pen, paper, do some drawing. You can probably do some visualization there. That can also help. Also, don't despair. Start working one rock at a time. I think thinking in rocks in purpose can really help you restructuring existing projects that might have grown over time, be bloated, be hard to disentangle, but just start moving things to their own rock, give them a purpose, describe it, and just go step by step. And with that, that's the end of my tutorial, my slides. Thank you all for attending. Renee is on a bit. I'm gonna go and check the chat. There he is again. So do we have any questions? Do we know?
First, before we start in the questions, thank you, Robin, very much for that stuff. And I will now also enable that everyone can release your microphone and clap and give a big hands or give some reactions for Robin. Thank you very much. That was very good. I really enjoyed the content, and even though it's a deep dive and it's basically just a thought seed to your minds, it's a very good guide, a summary, all the pitfalls, and see where you should try out how it really behaves. Thank you very much on that point, and I will now close the stream. So bye YouTube. See you soon on the next channels, and check out all the other talks on RoboCon.io, and buy a ticket for next year. Bye.